welcome back to this new plenary, which is about salt in the soup, how to create a sense of community, as Ulva mentioned. And it is a great honor to be here with you and to have an opportunity to moderate this last session with my colleague Trin Cap. Today our speaker for this plenary is Reverend Dr. Alex Wimberly, leader of the Corrymeela Peace and Reconciliation Center from Northern Ireland. For almost 7 years, Alex worked in Belfast as minister of the McCracken Memorial Presbyterian Church. Alex completed his PhD studies in history, mainly focusing on the theme of reconciliation in American Presbyterianism at the University of Notre Dame, after which he returned in Northern Ireland. Just for your information, Corrymeela is a place of gathering, work, faith, and discussion, bringing people of different backgrounds, different political and religious beliefs, and different identities together. And now Alex will try to reflect on what we have experienced ourselves over the last 2 days, and will introduce us common ground to come together. So our agenda for this session is we have 30 minutes for keynote. Then we will have about 10-15 minutes small group discussions. We have also 10 minutes for questions and answers. Please put your questions in our chat. And after this, we will try to wrap it up and conclude our two-day academy. So thank you very much for being with us. Now I want to give the floor to our speaker, Dr. Alex, please. The floor is yours.
You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but it is thrown out and trampled underfoot. Grace to you and peace from God, the Creator, and our Saviour, Jesus Christ, and greetings from the north coast of Ireland and from Corrymeela, this ecumenical Christian community dedicated to peace and reconciliation on this island and beyond. It is good to be with you for this conference and this discussion about populism, diversity, and democracy. I thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to come to you with the question of what we now will feed back into our communities from this time together. I'm very sorry to have missed the opening part of the conference yesterday, and in particular the discussion about the tastiness and tastelessness of populism, because I am curious as to how the English language use of the word tasteless has been explored in our discussion. Tastiness and tastelessness. First off, it is very good for folks like me to be reminded that populism has tastiness to it, because I am quick to conclude that modern populism is not to my taste. But I may be missing something by declaring it thus. I'm also fascinated by the exploration of tastelessness in our passage from Matthew 5:13. For tasteless in the culinary sense and in the biblical appearance in Matthew 5 connotes uselessness, a non-factor, something you would not notice, the pinch of salt that lacks punch. Yet in the context of populism, I use tasteless often to connote garishness, obnoxiousness, unrefined qualities, stuff you definitely notice because you are disgusted by them. When thinking of populism in modern politics and populist demagogic politicians like Donald Trump, I can easily turn to tasteless to describe the aesthetic, the tone, the behavior I personally find repulsive. And yet, populism will continue to be a part of the world and the church I want to be a part of. Populism has sometimes been a positive contribution made by those we often call the salt of the earth. And if we are to be true Democrats, then we will want to have populists as part of our diverse communities and churches. Otherwise, we wouldn't be very diverse. So can we make room for elements we find tasteless, not because they are easily ignored, but because they are so hard to swallow? And how do we achieve a balance of flavor in our communities that allows our different emphases and passions and identities to complement each other rather than overpower anyone? And this is why we turn to the metaphor of soup. Ah, soup. It's great for us. Soup is a great way for us to get our kids to eat the vegetables that they would otherwise avoid. Put asparagus or onions on a plate, and my children will quickly segregate them off to one side where they are no longer a threat. But stir the vegetables into the pot, or better yet, blend them into the broth, and the little cherubs will ingest them without fuss. As I see it, a soup serves as a great metaphor for a diverse community and a healthy democracy, particularly the chunky sort of soup that allows us to see different elements at work, their colors, their textures, their glistening sheens, a noodle floating by, or some rice emerging from below, a slice of carrot or some kale appearing in a spoonful. This wet salad of many tastes held together not only by the structure and boundary of the bowl, but by the way the cooking blends flavors together without diluting any distinct contribution. Likewise, a healthy democracy is held together by structure and agreed boundaries, but contains multiple elements that are allowed to be themselves in the advancement of the whole. Done right, this soup lets the tastiness and nutrition of individual ingredients rise, those ingredients we might otherwise push aside. In a good soup, they can not just be included, but enjoyed. And one key element is salt. When salt is applied correctly to a soup, you don't taste it as salt. You taste it as the enhanced flavor of the individual ingredients and the cohesion of the whole. Add salt well to a soup, and even my kids will eat broccoli. And if churches can add what is needed to our societies, then perhaps the tasty bits of populism can be enjoyed in our democracies without a garishness ruining the pot. But what are the tasty bits of populism? And how are we failing to create a good pot of democracy with them in it? I realize that I am speaking to the Conference of European Churches, but I'm going to assume that the populism that we have seen play out in my home country, the United States, will find echoes in our own contexts. I want to bring into the conversation, therefore, a recent article by George Packer of The Atlantic magazine. Packer has been undertaking a decade-long autopsy of the American dream. First in his 2013 book entitled The Unwinding, and now in The Four Americas, Packer argues that a once united national narrative has fractured into four competing stories that Americans are telling themselves within separated segments. Packer describes a free America, quote unquote, with its libertarian inclinations, a real America with a strong populist bent, a smart America with its progressive but elitist characteristics, and just America with its woke and corrective impulses. In the spirit of our tasty and tasteless considerations, Packer is able to identify the hidden strengths and glaring flaws of each competing narrative. Particularly interesting for us is his analysis of those who might refer to themselves as real Americans. as well as those of a second group, the liberal, progressive, left-leaning type that Packer deems the smart Americans. To give you a quick understanding of the difference, real Americans are very likely to be enthusiastic about Donald Trump. Smart Americans baffled by how such a man could ever come to power. Packer quite rightly bemoans the mindset of a zero-sum game that drives much of the unapologetic nativism in real America. He writes, "In real America, the winners are the hard-working folk of the white Christian heartland, and the losers are treacherous elites and contaminating others who want to destroy the country." Definitely sounds like a Trump rally. But Packer does well to highlight the communitarianism that real America displays, a communitarianism absent from other narratives, an aspect that helps to explain its appeal. Real America commits itself to a place and has a sense of limits. It's like a provincial village where everyone knows everyone's business. No one has much more money than anyone else, and only a few misfits ever move away. The villagers can fix their own boilers, thank you very much, and they go out of their way to help a neighbor in a jam. Apart from being able to fix their own boilers, this sounds like a very nice and a very typical church that I know of. Yes, the problem with real America is that a new face on the street will draw immediate attention and suspicion. But familiar faces, accepted bodies, have a real sense of belonging in this more homogeneous community, a belonging that is so instinctively valued by us humans, a belonging that is vigorously defended when threatened, a belonging that is increasingly needed in our isolating world. There is also, I think crucially, more economic solidarity held in the narrative of real America than in the other narratives. Populism has a bad reputation in many circles, including my own, but there is a cry for real economic justice in real America, a cry that resonates far beyond the provincial village. And what is striking, therefore, strikingly absent from smart America, is a similar sense of national identity and communal solidarity. The ones in smart America are the ones who adhere to a belief in meritocracy, but they are themselves disproportionately advantaged by built-in social structures. They are far more likely to start off and end up in the middle class, more likely to have graduated from a good school and to secure a place for their children in those institutions. The basic unit of smart America is not the neighborhood or the church, but the family or the peer group, not the state or the nation, but the same podcast subscription list. The great moment in life for a smart American is when they get into a prestigious university, because that means that it is more likely that the next generation in that family can get into one. Citizens of the world, smart Americans are connected by airplane, internet, and investments around the globe. And as such, Packer argues, they have lost the capacity and the need for a national identity, which is why they can't grasp its importance for others. They don't see the point of patriotism. But here's the rub. Because people still live their lives in an actual place, and the nation is still the largest place with which they can identify, patriotic feeling has to be tapped if we want to achieve anything big. If our goal is to slow climate change, or reverse inequality, or stop racism, or rebuild democracy, we will need the national solidarity that comes from patriotism. And so, while we don't want nativism, we do need populism in the soup. some national pride, some sense of collective togetherness as one of our ingredients, solidarity with those around us in each of our spoonfuls. And I do think that we ecumenists share a lot of the commonalities with the global citizenry that Packer associates with smart America, or perhaps smart Europe. Our desire to extend a sense of family and Christian unity around the world across denominational and national boundaries can lead us to struggle with the salience of local populism. We discount or ignore the power of solidarity that can be found at the local level, with the more homogeneous and familiar perhaps, but at least by those held together with a strong sense of national or local belonging. So, how do we make a soup where the individual flavors are each more enhanced, but instead of fighting with each other for dominance, they help balance each other out within this context of localism and populism? It seems to me that this Conference of European Churches has a great opportunity to provide just the sort of salty connectivity that our pots of democracy need. If we are to be the salt in this recipe, this enhancer of individual flavors in a diverse soup, we need to be in better relationship with those we hope to bring more cohesively into the mix. And to be in relationship does not mean to convince someone of something and to get them on board with your thinking. Perhaps this is why churches, particularly evangelical churches, have such a hard time not only making sense of populism, but then connecting to the wider church that is less evangelical. Because when soup, we cannot just be more of ourselves into the mix. We have to be with and for others, even if we dissolve in the process. When soup tastes of salt, it is awful. So emphasizing our own qualities would be a mistake. Pushing our own agenda, preaching and preaching so that others can be more like us, will only make the whole thing disgusting. Instead, we must figure out how our qualities can accentuate the tastier bits of others. And in a world of populism, we need to figure out how to enhance the best populist bits, the tastiness of populism. If Packer is right, then the connection to place, the sense of belonging, and the solidarity of a community of equals are what make populism such a good addition to the pot. Our question then is how to enhance those flavors of connection to place, sense of belonging, empowerment of equals can be enhanced without spoiling the broth with too much of the more garish and tasteless components, the anti-intellectualism, the nativism, the fear of being dominated by the other that can so quickly turn into tribalism. But if our theory is correct, being salt of the earth might bring both greater enhancement of individual flavors and a finer balance to the whole. The Northern Ireland context is one in which this balance is particularly hard to achieve. In part, that is because this is a place where everyone feels like a minority at risk. Everyone here has an acute sense of what it means or might mean to be out of power. Catholics have been the minority in Northern Ireland, and certainly the disenfranchised in government and society until the past few decades. Yet on the island of Ireland, the Northern Protestant majority becomes the minority. And so a united Ireland threatens the identity of those Protestants who are loyal to the United Kingdom more than they would be loyal to a unified Ireland. Loyalists make up the bulk of those who voted for Brexit, but they now feel abandoned by the British government they want to be loyal to because the Northern Ireland Protocol makes the possibility of a border in the Irish Sea a high likability, a possibility. Meanwhile, the overall majority in Northern Ireland that voted against Brexit feels all the more disenchanted with the majority in England particularly, who took them out of Europe and now may decide to put a hard border back across the island to make sense of trade regulations. As a result, we have an epidemic of distrust and disillusionment in Northern Ireland at the moment. Only 5% of people in Northern Ireland say they trust the UK government. Only 5%. That's down at the bottom there. UK government. Trust a lot? 1. Trust? 4. Total? 5. 5% of people in Northern Ireland say they trust the UK government. What is also striking in our context, and perhaps very likely in yours, is how few people trust that their voice makes a difference in society. 79% of people in Northern Ireland would say that they definitely do not or probably do not have an influence on decisions made in regards to what happens in Northern Ireland. 72% feel the same way when it comes to their own local decisions. People simply do not feel their voice is heard in this democracy, and that cannot stand. When people do not feel that they have a voice in the wider society and in a diverse democracy, they are more likely to turn inward to a community where they already feel rooted, where a homogeneous populism can become more nativistic, and a zero-sum game with clear winners and clear losers looks like the only game worth playing. This is where the ecumenical Christian church, I believe, can become the salt of the earth again, serving as localized grains of a diverse and inclusive kingdom, while loving those real communities of which we individually are a part, connecting them through our denominational, national, ecumenical networks to other communities that are different and yet still belong within the same pot. We have congregations sprinkled throughout this continent, willing to enhance the goodness in all the areas we touch. We have networks through schools and partnerships that reach people in ways that are meant to simply bring out the best in others' distinct flavor. And we have the ability to bring balance through the nurturing of respectful relationships, not only with those at the local level, but those with our cross-border ecumenical connections. At Corrymeela, we have worked for more than 55 years on pursuing the goal of peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Our mission is to be a community that welcomes each other into courageous conversations, where we deepen our respect for one another and create together a more hope-filled society for everyone. Now, Corrymeela has become well known around the world, particularly in the last 20 years, since European money has come in to secure the fragile peace in Northern Ireland. We have become, because of all of the professionalism involved in peacemaking these last few decades, experts in peace and reconciliation theory and analysis. But what success we have had has not come from our expertise or our brilliance in analysis. Our success has come, when it has come, from our honest and respectful relationships. The connections we have that bring us into the worlds of more and more people and bring their worlds into ours. Although we have learned much over the past many decades, what we have learned time and time again is that we don't have a solution that we can impose upon others that will fix everything. We aren't some perfect piece of salt that must be the standout ingredient, the secret to reconciliation. No, what we have learned is that we just need to be dissolved into relationships. We have learned that when you try to impose a solution, no matter how good it is, on someone else, they are more likely to resist it and turn away. If we want to have balance, if we want to hold everyone together, we need to instead simply work on getting better relationships with that person, with those people, with those groups, even those people, especially those people with whom we disagree. Because then, whatever solution is possible will more likely present itself in the space we create together. In other words, better relationships are the route to reconciliation. Salt is what makes the soup work. It brings out the best tasty bits in all the individual elements and helps the whole thing hold together. We transform division through human encounter by being in relationship with more and more different people, being changed by them, letting our old sense of self die so that a better sense of we might resurrect. At Corrymeela, we have spent so much time trying to learn from this that it's surprising sometimes just how far off we still are, even though we believe this is the way to go. I'll give you the example that because we have spent so much time trying to heal the divisions between Protestants and Catholics, we have not been in relationship as much as we should with other communities, with non-Christians, with those whose marginalization is felt because of race or disability. And so it becomes news to us that in the last few years, the number of race hatred crimes, violence against people of different ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, has actually overtaken sectarian violence. So the people who are most at risk in Northern Ireland are not those who are Catholic in a Protestant area or Protestant in a Catholic area, but those who are newcomers, non-whites in this society. And the only way that we as Corrymeela could become part of a better future is to change from within, to have new relationships, and to let our new relationships in this soup change who we are. Those new relationships will expose us to experiences we cannot imagine, making us passionate about injustices we have not seen or pretended not to see, and to have our well-being tied up all the more with the well-being of others. To have the salt in us dissolve into the pot will not only allow us to do what we have been called to do, it will hopefully bring out the best in others and bring balance to the whole. I stop simply by saying that as we go back into our own communities and take with us what we have picked up, learned from these last 2 days, I am convinced that the task of the church, the work of Christians, and the challenge of the Conference of European Churches as salt of the earth is not to try to overpower ignorance with truth or to only proclaim what we want the world to hear. It is rather to live with and for others as a new creation without fear, to live with and for others, and particularly the other. And if it's the populist in my case, it means the populist. And finally, to blend, to help blend heaven and earth into one pot by joining diverse people together around local tables of respectful relationships, to be salt in the soup. Thank you very much, and I hope that that will give us at least something to talk about in the next few minutes.
Thank you very much, Alex. It was really inspiring presentation. You touched very important questions and opened up all the boxes from the American point of view and us from the Northern Ireland. Now I will ask to our participants to put their questions into the chat box. And if you have a question and want to ask directly to our speaker, please raise your hand.
Can I just, because Alex was in our group and he posed us a question of the cultural situation of populism, understanding populism, and Arjun, you were just describing the Eastern context for the populism. I just want to, is it possible you could just describe that very quickly, just to finish that one? It's quite interesting to hear how this is in Eastern Europe.
Yes, really, I was talking about the Velvet Revolution in Armenia, which started in 2018, and new populism movement with the help of Nikol Pashinyan, they managed to change the government, and they create new government with new members, and recently, 2 days ago, we have parliamentary elections in Armenia, and he managed to win this election. He, as a person, he is a big populist, and people trust him. The question is. How Nikol Pashinyan, as a populist person, can manage to make people trust in his government. It is really different dimensions, and it is really difficult to understand how after the war with Azerbaijan and Turkey, and after the losses of territory, people can choose him. That's the question. And yeah, that was my thoughts to, and that what I wanted to share in our group. Sigrid. Mm-hmm. If we have another questions, please, the floor is open for them.
There is a question in the chat from Bianca, I think.
Yes, I would just read it. How to get in contact with others who are different, hold different views in the first place? So leaving the bubble in brackets to then develop a respectful relationship. So how to come out from the bubble?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit in one of the earlier breakout rooms. I'm convinced that, you know, if you go into a conversation with people who are different than you and you want to talk about a contentious issue, you're just going to get into a sparring match, and whatever you want to talk about is just going to push the other person away. And the goal, the initial goal, has to be one of risk. That, you know, you go into it not knowing how it's going to end up, with no predetermined outcome, nothing you're trying to get out of the situation except for a better relationship with that person. And so how to get folks attracted to the idea of coming into conversation with you, into relationship with you, is sometimes you need a third thing. You need a separate project you can all work on. You can figure out what you actually do hold commonality with and talk about that instead. We need to do some preliminary work in just getting to know one another. And that is, it takes courage, it takes openness, it takes faith, it takes the belief to go into those conversations and say, I have as much to learn from this person as this person has to learn from me, which is a very difficult thing for evangelicals and Christians and preachers to actually achieve, to actually reach that level of humility. But I do think that when you get into better relationships with folks, something good will come out of it, if just you are exposed to the reality of their world and understand more the passion that is driving them. I know at Corrymeela, we would bring people from militant Protestant, militant Catholic backgrounds together, and we would just come together for a cup of tea, just have a chance to play a game together. And the conversations that happen around the table then open up new possibilities and new avenues for discussion. Unfortunately, at Corrymeela, what we found is that people would find commonality over, perhaps even grief. Someone who was killed by a British soldier would speak to someone whose daughter had been killed by a British soldier will meet the mother of someone who was killed by an IRA gunman, and they discover that they had a connection in terms of their grief, in terms of their humanity, and that allowed them to overcome other stereotypes and see the person as part of their story rather than a stereotype with another story. So I do think that the way to do it is not to talk about the issue, but just to get to know the people.
Yes, thank you, Alex. We have another question from our participant, Beat from Church of Norway, please.
Thank you, and thank you for a good presentation. This was very interesting. I was thinking the Corrymeela reconciliation projects over so many decades. What is your experience with fear? In our group now, we talked a little bit about it. It has been mentioned earlier in this conference. Fear as a driving force for joining a populist movement, or populism as an answer to fear in society. But I'm curious as to how Corrymeela deals with that in the concrete reconciliation projects you've worked in, particularly perhaps in Northern Ireland and Ireland, because there must be so much fear. We can all relate to it in our own contexts. In Norway, a church member called my boss and was expressed a genuine fear of immigration. Now, he's a member in a majority church in a very peaceful and rich country. There is no reason to fear in the first place, but he was genuinely afraid of changes to society. But then, when you look at the experiences of Ireland and Northern Ireland, how have you dealt with that? Because in times of conflict and follow-up after conflict, have you worked with that in a special way?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I do think that the heart of so much of our conflict is the fear of being dominated. It's the fear of power in the hands of others. And the cynic in me would say that if you are in a position of power, or a group that has not had to fear that, and the cynic in me would say, if you fear becoming a minority, it's probably because how you witness minorities being treated in the society that you are in, and that. So, I mean, I think that says a bit in just of itself. I think the way the way that we've thought about it and the way that we try to address it is to say, we have this fear of being dominated. Why? I think it's because we, being humans, have fallen into the rut of this zero-sum game, that we think it is only a win-lose binary. We do not think that there is a way to create solutions, create a future that can be win-win. We have that zero-sum game is just such a corrosive power in our societies. And we see it playing out in Northern Ireland now, in that the party that is in power, there's a perception that their days are numbered, and so they have no impetus in relinquishing power. They only have the incentive to hold on to it and make it more difficult for others to gain it. In the States, again, there is not only really just corrosive language about people being replaced by immigrants, and that fear of being replaced. The folks that were involved in the Capitol riots on the 6th of January, the folks that are influenced by the QAnon phenomenon, they cut across all socioeconomic strata. What they have in common is that they live in a location in the States where their population is starting to become a minority and a new group is starting to become the majority. And that fear of becoming the minority is driving the irrational embrace of populism and violence in political violence in the States. So to me, I think the key is to try to get into better relationships. We've seen this in so many different examples that when you actually meet a real live living example of X group, you are exposed to the reality that these people are not people that you need to be afraid of. These are people like you. And so again, the relationships and the connectivity is what's so important. And I think also the combating the idea of a zero-sum win-lose outcome as the only game we are playing is incredibly important. It's the only thing really that gives me help in terms of the context of climate change, is that here is something where we might be able to face a shared future together and start building one that makes sense for everyone, because it is such an acute problem. But I do think that the win-lose dynamic of a zero-sum game is what causes so much fear in our society.
Thank you, Alex. We have a little time for another question in box. Sigrid asks us, when the church strikes up relationship with left or right-wing populists locally or nationally, how do you avoid the greater society seeing that as the church in coalition with populists?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that question because I don't have a lot of experience with churches striking up relationships with left organizations or right-wing populist groups in the same way that it might be true with national churches. Just because I come from a context that doesn't have a national church. We have a cultural dominating religious group sometimes. And certainly I think there is great danger in that you end up proving that Christians, a lot of Christians, are more interested in holding on to power than they are about preaching the gospel, and that it does become a fact that I do think it's a great danger when we become politicized, not because, as someone was saying, I think last night, to be involved in politics and to be involved in the church is to be involved in relationships and actual human beings. And so it's very difficult, if not impossible, to separate politics from religion. But I think that if you get partisan and you get associated with a political party, you run the great risk of being a church that is more like a culture that wants to hang on to power rather than a prophetic voice speaking to power. And the only other thing I would add to that, and it's not particularly connected, is that I think, and maybe going back to the idea of fear, the one group in this world that should be the least afraid of death and losing itself and its sense of self is the Christian church, not only because our founder said, fear not, but also because our faith is based on the idea of resurrection. So anytime we experience some sort of death and the relinquishment of power, we're actually being more and more like our true selves, and we can have faith that something all the more wonderful will resurrect, even if everything we see around us falls apart.
And our last question from Bianca, as our time is very limited. Please, Bianca.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on the other question and your reply to it, Alex, because I'm still wondering how we bring people, how do they make the change within themselves to actually be ready to meet someone, even on the different kind of project. As you said, you don't talk directly about the issue, but work on something else together. But how to actually, because, we talked also a lot about polarization and, people are here and there and they don't even start talking to each other or start meeting each other at some place. So I'm still wondering how that actually, maybe you have some examples from Corrymeela how people actually end up at your center. Like, how do they actually get there in the first place?
A lot of people come to our center because it's a nice place to look around. It's a beautiful site on the north coast, and we lure them in with the landscape, and then we ask them deep probing questions about their. No, we actually just let them be themselves, and they hopefully reconnect with a part of themselves they have neglected, and that allows them to connect to others as human beings first, rather than partisans or would-be opponents. This will be an insufficient answer, but I'm so glad we're coming to the end, so I won't be able to go on as long as you would otherwise like me to. And just to say that when we're in conversation, when we are in conflict with someone, first off, we have to remember that conflict is inevitable. The only way to avoid conflict is to avoid relationships with other human beings. And so we should not be upset that we are in conflict with those that are as equally human as we are. But I do think that we can register our own discomfort when we get into a relationship with someone. And the work is to try to transform that discomfort and that desire to dismiss someone as, I already know who you are, I know everything I need to know about you because you have said such and such and such and such, with a spirit of curiosity. What breaks down relationships and what tells you that a relationship is broken or not operating the way it should is when it lacks curiosity. When you are continually curious about the person you love, that relationship will be a long-lasting one. When you can turn your discomfort with someone into a curiosity, you can lean into that moment rather than pull away. And that would be the only thing I would probably add to what I said earlier, Bianca, and I hope it helps a little bit.
Thank you so much. And I think this is a marvelous thing with what to end up. So the curiosity, and I think also, as you said, that Corrymeela is a very beautiful place. So it's also about the curiosity to come and visit. So I think this is something we all should do. Thank you for the invitation. So I think we clap the hands. Thank you very, very much. It was really, really, really interesting. And we will give the floor to Bianca and Søren to end up our online academy.